Welcome, everyone, to this week's edition of the show. I'm Nancy.
And I'm Crystal.
And this is the first time you're seeing us. If you're seeing us on our video, we are the co-hosts of the Dirt on the Past podcast. And this week, we're in a completely new location. We're so excited to announce that we're collaborating with the Museum of the Rockies. And today we are in this incredibly cool studio they have right down in the dinosaur hall. And we are going to be bringing you a new version of the podcast called The Dirt on the Past.
The museum edition.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So these podcasts will be more than just podcasts. We're being filmed. We're actually being videoed in this great studio that has been decorated to look like sort of what Charles Darwin's office may have looked like. We did not attempt to make it historically accurate. Ashley decorated this thing and brought in cast specimens of all different kinds of things and fossils. There's tools in here, there's maps in here, there's all sorts of great things, and it's very inspirational. So it's a great background for us. But in each of these museum edition episodes, we are going to be showcasing artifacts from the Museum of the Rockies collection. And we're going to be having conversations with experts in those fields. So for our first museum edition today, we are joined today by Chelsea Hogan. Ashley Hall had to leave today, so we'll be roping her in another day. And they both work in the education department at the Museum of the Rockies. And Rylan Brunkart is running the show from behind the scenes there, front of the scenes, and then back to behind the scenes. And so hopefully Rylan will be able to take care of any technical issues that we're likely to have, right, Crystal? Okay.
Exactly.
So they brainstormed this collaboration with us, and we're really excited to be doing this all together. We do have another person in the room who's responsible for actually bringing artifacts out from the collection, and that's Michael Fox. And there he is making a tiny little cameo. Yay, Michael. So we are going to get started and talk about what today's podcast is about. So I'll turn it over to you, Crystal.
All right. Well, we're so excited to have this opportunity to podcast from this amazing studio space. And thanks to you, Chelsea and Ashley and Rylan and Michael and the Museum of the Rockies for allowing us and making this happen. We're excited to move forward with the Museum of the Rockies and the museum edition of this podcast because we know how many artifacts are in the collections of the Museum of the Rockies that often will never see the light of day.
So we have been down there. We've been
been
down there doing real research, and there's some good stuff down there, right?
And so this is going to be a great opportunity to be able to showcase some of those objects, some of those artifacts that may never be included in an exhibit. So it's super exciting. So thank you guys.
Of course, it's such a pleasure.
Yay.
And of course, we're here at the E.L. Wiegand Digital Learning Studio. It's a brand new studio that we just opened a few months ago, and we're still figuring out all the many ways that we can use it. And so this is such a pleasure for us to work with our friends.
First in line. Exactly. Yeah.
So this is so much fun. I'm really, really excited to dig in.
Well, thanks, Chelsea.
Unintended.
Yeah. Oh, I got it. The dirt on the past. I know this is going to be a good one tonight. Okay. So for our first museum episode, we are going to focus on a topic that is near and dear to our hearts. Crystal, we're going to be talking about the fact that Extreme History headquarters are open in the red light district in Bozeman, and that is a topic that also Chelsea and Ashley have been focused on for the Museum of the Rockies for the upcoming season of Haunted Mountain Theater, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later. But the topic is historical sex work in Western red light districts. And Chelsea, maybe you can start by telling us about the Haunted Mountain Theater and why, in particular, this year it relates to Butte's red light district, specifically the Dumas brothel.
Absolutely. Well, the Haunted Mountain Theater program started in 2019 by our executive director, Chris Dobbs, who comes from a history museum and a theater background. And he's been doing this kind of programming in museums for about 25 years. So, before I was born. And so this is right. All of us were.
We'll just like the whole group with that.
Yeah. And so, the sort of the point of Haunted Mountain Theater is to teach history through theater. So we are very, very focused on trying to be as authentic as possible while also being entertaining. And it always happens around Halloween time. So it's also important that it's spooky.
Oh, that sounds like a great way to learn history.
Yeah,
And
it's
history can be
really
spooky.
fun. Yeah, and it's a special program too, because not only is it a live theater production, but it also incorporates all of the amenities of the Taylor Planetarium, which is the
Oh,
only planetarium in Montana. And there's also a component at the 1890s Tinsley House. And this year we're having a Victorian Halloween party.
oh,
And we're also
fantastic.
having Extreme History
Get your
come,
costume.
which we can talk about a little bit later. But my colleague Rylan and I are producing it along with Chris Dobbs.
Wow.
And we are always just trying to think about what's interesting, what's compelling, and what's scary about Montana's history. And as you know, we don't really have to look that far because Montana has a really kind of crazy and complicated and sometimes horrific history.
Indeed.
And
Indeed. Yeah.
you know, we were really compelled, you know, for me, if I can just say, and I don't know if you relate to this or not, I think you do. But as a woman, especially thinking about sex work, I think you can't help but sort of say, like, how far would I go? Would I ever do that? Or what would that be like? You can sort of so easily imagine yourself, even if you don't fully know the complexities of it. You kind of automatically are intrigued.
You wonder what these women's lives were like, especially
Exactly.
during these times where these new towns were being settled in the West. Yeah.
Exactly. And so when we're talking about scary Montana history, certainly brothel culture is right in line. And then we have the Dumas brothel, which is, as we'll discuss, the longest running, or it's no longer open for business.
True. Very
So
important
don't
point.
try to go there. Anyone in I mean, you can go there, but not for services.
Yes. Just a
It did
tour.
close in 1982, but the longest running house of ill repute in the entire country. And it is famously known to be haunted. So there are a lot of cool ghost stories that surround the Dumas brothel. And Rylan and if I can speak for you, Rylan, we're really specifically compelled, you know, just thinking about as we dug further into it, as we visited it, as we dug into the archives, really looking at the complexities of the women's experience or you know, trying to imagine ourselves. And Rylan actually really took the helm and wrote most of, if not really all. I mean, we really credit her with that section of our play. So we have 6 different vignettes that all relate to Montana history. And the Who Killed Eleanor Knott story is the big finale that takes place in the Dumas brothel.
Okay.
So,
And we'll hear a little bit more about that as we get into
absolutely.
it. But so the Dumas brothel then is really the central kind of focus place of where Haunted Mountain Theater is going to be having.
Yes.
It's exciting.
Absolutely. And
So-
this question of who killed this madam.
No,
Eleanor
yeah,
Knott.
so I highly recommend, if it's not all sold out, people try to go. But we're going to give you a little bit of background then on brothel culture, red light districts in Bozeman and in Butte, and maybe even pulling in from some podcasts we've had earlier where we've talked about Los Angeles and other places in the West. So Crystal, the Dumas brothel that Chelsea was just talking about is essentially built about the same year as the brothel that Extreme History is headquartered in Bozeman's Old Red Light District.
Correct.
So remind us again about the history of the house, sort of like the who, why, what, when, sort of who built it, why was it built, and how long it was in use as a parlor house. And then maybe we can discuss a little bit about how it compares to the Dumas and look at the Dumas too. So yeah, just tell Rylan when you want to pull up a slide of it too.
Yeah. So like Nancy said, our Extreme History Project headquarters is located within a historic brothel, and you're seeing a photograph of the building now. So this building was built in 1891, And the Dumas in Butte was built in 1890. So very similar time periods that these two brothels opened. And ours, I'll tell you a little bit more about ours because of course I know a little bit more about ours, but it was built in 1891 by a gentleman whose name was Joseph Lindley. Now, Joseph Lindley was kind of he was a real estate broker. He was into cattle ranching. He was a fairly wealthy member of Bozeman's business elite. And so the reason that he built this interesting is because Montana had become a state in 1889. And when they were deciding where the capital of the state was going to be, they opened it up to a vote. And so they were voting on which city in Montana was going to get the capital. And of course, Bozeman was vying for the Capitol building, as was Butte, as was Anaconda, as was Helena, Virginia City, all these different places. About 7 cities were vying to become the capital of Montana. And
Thinking you
everyone
bring a
wanted
lot
it.
of money
Yeah.
to this
A
the
lot of
town,
money
right?
would come
Yeah,
in
power,
if you
money.
got that capital built, that capital in your town. So a couple of other of our businessmen here in Bozeman, one being Nelson Story, was really beautifying our Main Street. So they were building a lot of brick buildings on Main Street. And so Nelson Story made a deal with Joseph Lindley. Joseph Lindley owned the land that this brothel was eventually built on. And he said, if you build and pay for, or if you build a brothel on that property, I will pay for it. And so they made this handshake deal. And so that's what happened. Nelson Story gave Joseph Lindley the money. Joseph Lindley built this 2-story brothel and it opened for business in 1891. But there was an agreement between the two that if we got the capital, Joseph Lindley would not have to pay Nelson Story back.
Oh,
But if we
Nelson,
didn't get the capital, Lindley had to pay Nelson Story back. Well, of course, we didn't get the capital in Bozeman. Helena got the capital. So Joseph Lindley was supposed to pay Nelson Story back, but he never did that. And so a couple of years down the road, Nelson Story sued him for this money and in return got the house. And so Nelson Story then owned it for a few years. So Joseph Lindley was the builder. Then it went to Nelson Story. He owned it for a time, and then he transferred it to his son, who owned it for a time. And then in about 1913, Nelson Story's son sold it. So that's kind of the ownership. So this brothel was always owned by, during its heyday, was always owned by a man, but it was occupied by women. And one woman who we know was the madam for many years, her name was Libby Hayes. And so she was the madam of this building, probably from about 1900 to her death in 1913. And so she was a woman who had grown up in Kentucky. She came out west with her 2 other sisters. So Libby, Hattie, and Maddie. I know.
I know.
I know. They all 3 sisters worked in Bozeman's red light district. Libby worked in this house and Hattie and Maddie worked in other houses in Bozeman. And so, but Libby worked in this house most of her time here. And until about 1912, like I said, she died in 1913. In 1912, she must have saved enough money. She bought the property right next door to this house and moved there.
Yeah, can we go back to the slide,
Yeah.
Rylan? Because I would love, Crystal, can you tell us, we have a box there
Yeah.
around
What a
the
circle.
building. And just
Yeah.
to say, I mean, that's a very handsome house.
It is.
This parlor house is a nice looking 2-story structure. It's amazing to me that it was so out in the open and they're trying to beautify the red light district. You know, like
Yeah.
that was seen everywhere. And we see this going on everywhere in these towns around Montana. Beautifying the red light district was part of what you needed to
Yeah.
convince people you could have the
Right.
capital.
Not getting
which
rid of
is a
the red
little
light
weird.
district, not hiding it.
No,
Yeah.
and not getting rid of it.
Beautifying it.
Exactly. So it's that open thing where it's not legal, right? But it's supposed to be in this area. So can you talk about some of the other buildings on that map too,
Yeah.
and what else was around there? Because you didn't have just like your neighbor was Mr. Lindley himself or
Right,
something.
right.
So talk a little bit about that.
So what you're looking at right now is what we call a Sanborn map. And Sanborn fire insurance maps were created by the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company, and they were basically for fire insurance claims. So that's why you see the different colors on there. The yellow represents wood frame buildings, the pink represents brick buildings, and the blue represents stone buildings. And you'll see that our building has the red box around it, and it is pink, so it's a brick building. So that what is originally what our building was brick. It's been stuccoed over in the last, probably in the 1930s, 1940s. They put stucco on the outside to kind of keep it standing, because the brick is often deteriorating at that time. But the red light district is encompassed within the kind of that picture that you see right there on the kind of the north side of that street. And so a lot of those buildings that you're seeing there are houses of prostitution. And then also the Chinese community lived right in that area as well. So where all the buildings that surround our building are occupied by either Chinese or other houses of prostitution. So so that is what the red light district was. It's kind of where all the vice was contained, all the vice in the city of Bozeman, and they were often called restricted districts. And so a lot of town people and members of the community like to put all the vice, all the saloons, the houses of prostitution, the Chinese all together in one part of town, because then they could contain it. So that, the upper class women didn't have to worry about a house of ill repute kind of popping up in the house next to them in the good part of town. It was all going to be right here. And then the police could kind of monitor and contain that as well.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right.
So that's a little bit about our house and a little bit about our historic building and the history of that historic building, and this woman, going back to Libby Hayes, who lived in this building and worked out of this building. There was a lot of other women who worked under her in prostitution, and we know their names, but we don't know a lot about them. We know more about Libby Hayes because she owned property, she owned goods, and so when she died, she left a will, and they did a probate record. So we have a lot of information from that probate record. So a lot of the women who worked under her as prostitutes were more transitory. They often didn't use their real names, so we don't have as much information about them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That is so fascinating. And Nancy, I know that you've done a lot of digging into the Butte
Wish I did more digging.
prostitution history.
Yeah.
And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about how the Dumas got started and if there are similarities and differences.
Yeah, and it was very interesting to me because I've been hearing a lot about Crystal's research over the years about Bozeman, and we've heard a little bit on a previous podcast. It's Anne-Marie Koistra, right? That's a really good one. And then to be able to dig into Butte a little, as soon as you talked about the Dumas, I was like a dog on a bone with that. So that's super great. And maybe Rylan, if we can go to the next slide, let's take a look. So there is an image of the Dumas from the outside as it looks today. And you can see it says 1890 when it was built there right at the top. So pretty fancy architecture. And then again, we have these Sanborn insurance maps, and the blow up of this one, this is a 1961 that they happen to have laying out there. So I snapped a photo of it. And I have an arrow pointing to where on East Mercury Street. But in terms of the history, I really went to Ellen Baumler's overview of sort of this whole vice district in Butte that she had published in 1998 in, which was the magazine? Do you remember,
It was
Crystal?
the Montana Magazine of Western History.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic article, and it's available online, I think, if people want to access it.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah. Okay. We'll talk about how you can get it later. But what we know from the research that Ellen and others have done in the archives there at Butte, because they have wonderful archives, is that Butte in the 1870s was really getting going with mining. And it was really just kind of tents and camps in the 1870s. And there weren't a lot of formal buildings yet, but it was starting to be late. So this was a little bit north. So if we look at East Mercury Street on that map, and then you look at there's an alleyway behind where the Dumas would have been on that. And then the street to the north of that is Galena Street. The street north of that is Park Street. And that was where you had all these tents and camps first beginning. And north of Park Street was where all these mines were, where people were finding gold, silver, and just starting to get into copper in the 1870s and 1880s. Well, during the 1880s, things start to get a little more formal. So in the 1870s, women were just outside, and they called them the women of the line, that would wait outside the mines, outside of the tent camps. And then with the 1880s, as they started to formalize these streets a bit more and build some buildings, that got pushed down to Park Street. And then literally as we get mid 1880s into 1890s, you have Galena Street, which on that eastern half of the street, that very building on the corner is called the Cooper Block building, and that housed a saloon that I think you said was run by Dirty Mouth Jean.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dirty Mouth Jean.
Which we just had to get that in there because that's quite a name, right? I know. And actually the owners of that building are the same folks that built the Dumas. So these were two brothers, Arthur and Joseph. They were Nadu. They were French Canadians. So I don't know if I'm saying that right. But Joseph's wife was Delia, and her original name was Dumas. So they named it the Dumas. And apparently this was pretty common for men to name after she cared if it was a brothel or not, because the Dumas was built specifically to be a brothel. And it was built on Mercury because that was right when, as you said, places are vying for the capital. Butte was one of them, and they were kind of beautifying. So in the 1880s, you had the beginning in Butte, because Butte was like any other red light district on steroids, pretty much rivaled anywhere except, kind of maybe what we think of as Vegas sometimes, but it's just crazy. And it was the biggest city in between Chicago and San Francisco in the US, and just incredibly wealthy by the time we're getting into the 1880s and 90s. So you had a lot of burlesque and vaudeville theater going on where things were out in the open. People were drinking in theaters, performing. There was probably also prostitution. There was the theater comique, and then that got closed down. It became the current Metals building, and everything got pushed south again to kind of sandwich it in that East Mercury Street. So eventually across from the Dumas, you get built just a row of these things called cribs, not a nice parlor house like your offices, your current offices in Bozeman, not like the Dumas or the Hotel Victoria and the Windsor Hotel, all these other beautiful buildings that were also on Mercury Street. So you did have just this row of rooms that were door, window, very small rooms facing the street. That's the Blue Range that was built in 1897. So things, though, after 1910 start to get a little seedier, and that's when we start getting people like Carrie Nation and crusaders coming to town trying to get rid of the vice and the temperance movement and all of that, and Butte's not really having any of it. There's some people trying, but it's not really working because they're making a lot of money off of this district. They are paying over $2,000 a month into the coffers. So there's just kind of no way they can afford to shut it down.
Right. And sorry to interject,
Go
but
ahead. Yeah.
when you say making a lot of money, I mean, you're not just meaning like the business owners or the prostitutes or anything like that. You're talking about the city itself.
Talking about the city, the collection
like
from the whole vice district and the police. Exactly. So the mayor, and it's going to help run the city, basically. And again, they're trying to keep it to Mercury Street, the alleyway behind it, a little bit on Galena, and sort of that side of Wyoming Street there too. And so everything is over there. We start seeing that to take advantage of more miners coming in and all of these opportunities to make more money, that there's an addition put on the back in 1913 of the Dumas, finished in 1914. That adds a whole bunch of cribs out the back all the way onto the alleyway, which eventually becomes called Venus Alley. And there's cribs or windows and doors that prostitutes are working out of facing that alley right behind the red arrow. And then eventually in 1924, they end up remodeling the interior of the Dumas to create more cribs inside and taking away the fancy parlor house and bar and things like that. And that was coinciding with high copper prices and things like that. So I'll stop there for now. And that was probably
interesting.
a
Yeah,
lot,
yeah.
but it's interesting because the Dumas is a much larger structure than the building that we see in the red light district in Bozeman, but it's a much larger city. There's
Yeah.
more money. And these were properties that in a lot of cases changed hands. Like the cribs across the street, the Blue Angel cribs, changed ownership a lot, even though they stayed cribs. The Dumas stayed in the hands of the Nadeau brothers until 1925 when Joseph actually died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask actually a quick architecture and material question?
Yeah.
Because the Butte is, or the Dumas in Butte is, you know, I think at least, you know, when we roll up to it, immediately you're struck by how beautiful of a building it is. And it's made of brick. But is your building made out of brick?
It is.
And is there
Yeah.
something to that?
Yeah, and I think that that brick really signified a town that, especially here in the West, that was established. It was going to stay put. It was going to be successful and flourish. And so all these buildings, like our building in Bozeman, they definitely wanted to build it out of brick because that really showed that this town was going places. And so
Yeah.
same with Butte. I'm sure that brick was an important built a way to build these buildings.
I think
so-
there's an insurance issue
Right.
too. And I
Yeah.
think given what's going on inside and people smoking and cooking and everything,
Mhm.
yeah, you know, it's an investment. And
Mhm.
these were considered very valuable businesses and properties.
And maybe also, and I know we'll get to this a little bit later, but speaking to the culture in this area and the violence that could be going on and the dynamics between the prostitutes and the police. When we went to the archives in Butte, we learned about Beverly Snodgrass,
Yes.
who had her brothel burnt down by the police. So brick also could
Mhm.
potentially help
Yeah.
prevent. Actually, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. We could talk about this forever.
So I know, Chelsea, when you started researching this for Haunted Mountain Theater, you had a lot of questions
Mhm.
about the history of prostitution. So
Yeah.
I thought you might want to ask Crystal some things about, just as you were saying, what it was like to imagine yourself, what these women's lives were like.
Absolutely. And I think what originally compelled me, of course, there's that idea of like putting ourselves in that position. But I feel like in general, a lot of times when, you know, brothels and prostitution and all of this is brought up, a lot of times it's talked about by men
Mhm.
and it's very salacious and very wink wink and ooh, isn't it so
Like, oh, the
you know,
good
like
old days,
sexy?
maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Mm.
my thought was maybe it was like that. And it was really, really important to us, to Rylan and I, that we centered our story on the women. And even though we knew that would be harder, because of course we're not, you know, prostitutes from 1955 Butte, and we're not historians either, that would really take a lot of effort and research and speaking with experts such as yourselves and Michael Fox and all of that. But we really, really wanted to try, we thought it was a really, really important effort to try to put ourselves in that place and explore who these characters might be, like Eleanor Knott and Dirty Mouth Jean and Bonita Farron and all those people. So Crystal, maybe you could tell us a little bit about, from your research, what was it like?
Yeah, so you know, and I think, Chelsea, when we moved our offices into this historic brothel, we had the same questions because we hadn't focused in on research on prostitution before that, really, but we took a deep dive because we wanted to interpret these women's lives in a really accurate way. And so we did the deep dive and we learned a lot about the women who lived in our building, but also the women who lived in the whole red light district. And we really focused on other towns in the West as well, and Montana specifically. And so we have now a much better understanding. And I just want to say that there is kind of that stereotypical version of this woman, of these women who worked in this field and did sex work. But we try to really interpret these women in a way that kind of just showcases exactly what their lives were like. And our tagline for Extreme History is history isn't pretty. So I'm just going to start by saying that because these women's lives were not pretty, but to kind of set that up, I want to just talk about the hierarchy of prostitution in Bozeman, but also in Butte and throughout the West and throughout the nation at this time. And most of our information is focused more in the West because prostitution in the West and the East were somewhat different. But in the West, we did have these parlor houses like the Dumas and the house that we have in Bozeman. These were definitely parlor houses. These were places where men would come in and feel like they were in their own house. And so that was a real, they did that architecture was very deliberate because they wanted these men to feel at home. And so these parlor houses were places of luxury, and they were beautiful, and they were expensive. So kind of the next step down was houses that weren't parlor houses, but they weren't cribs like you were talking about, Nancy. They were more kind of just run of the mill houses and buildings that had lots of rooms. So that was kind of the next step down. Of course, the price went down a little bit, and the services were not as long or as luxurious. The next step down was cribs. And a crib is basically just a very small room that has a bed and a wash basin. And that's kind of the architecture that we see a lot in the West, especially in Butte. We see that a lot. We see that in Bozeman. We had these buildings that were just built, like Nancy said, with a door and a window, a door and a window, a door and a window. And each of those were just little rooms. And services were pretty quick, and those were usually the cheapest. Well, they were fairly cheap. On the next rung down was where Chinese women worked. And of course, I just want to clarify that, the women working in the parlor houses and in these houses this was their choice most often to work in these buildings and to work in these places. But Chinese women, that was not the case. It was not their choice to work in this profession.
They were trafficked into that.
Yeah. So
Okay.
they were trafficked in. They were oftentimes sold in China, brought over to San Francisco, auctioned off, and brought up to Butte or Bozeman or Virginia City or these other places. And they were often auctioned off for $400 to $600, which in the 1880s, 1890s, that's a lot of money. So and so then they were brought in and they were placed in one of these cribs and often worked to death. And we have in the Bozeman newspaper, we have a few articles that mention that, a Chinese woman who was working in the underworld, which is what they called it, committed suicide. And so, it's pretty horrific.
Yeah.
That's a question about that. So if they were trafficked in and sold, does that mean once they get to the crib, they're not making money
They're
themselves?
making no money. They're
Wow.
making no money. Where
Slavery.
the women, it's slavery.
Yeah.
It's,
Sex
they were
slavery,
enslaved.
yeah.
They were enslaved in these places.
Mm.
And of course, the women above them were making some money. They weren't making a lot of money either. The madams were the ones who were making the money. And so that's a very small portion of all the women doing this work. So that kind of sets us up for the context of these women's lives.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
What a
you-
downer, Crystal.
I know. But you mentioned a lot of them are, you mentioned this one woman who there's an article that she committed suicide in the
Yeah.
Bozeman paper, but you also have done research, Crystal, of how many of these women have died of some sort of drug overdose. Probably they've become addicted along the way because of the horrific circumstances that they were living in, or they had contracted some other diseases. So I think you even have a little bit of research. Should we move to that next slide? And maybe you could speak to that. So we know there was violence, but as you say, it's not just violence from the men that they had to worry about. There's all these other issues.
Yeah. So this slide is research that we did taken from about 1885 to 1922 in Bozeman. And there's a book at our Clerken County Recorder's Office that lists all the deaths of everyone from 1885 to 1922. And so I just went through this book, and every time, and each person is listed by their occupation. And when there was a woman listed with the occupation of prostitution, I noted that. And so these are the women who died from 1885 to 1922, whose occupation was listed as prostitute. And so you can really just see, the different things they were dying of: suicide, Jesse Smith suicide, Lillian Stewart overdose of morphine, Hattie Hayes, 29 years old, necrosis of the sacrum. She died of sepsis, which is kind of an infection of the blood. Gertrude Jenkins, 1908, 23 years old,
Never mind.
a bacterial infection in the bloodstream, sepsis again. You're seeing some patterns forming here, aren't you? So a lot of times they're dying of diseases that were a result of an STD.
Right.
And then also you're seeing deaths from overdose of morphine, alcoholism. So that's how these women were dying. And they were dying young, 29 years old, 20 years old, 23 years old, 34 years old. Lizzie Woods, who I'm going to talk a little bit about later, again, died at the old age for a madam. She was a madam of 65 years old. She died of nephritis, which is an infection or inflammation of the kidneys. And I asked a doctor one day, I
Yeah.
said, what is nephritis? Because we don't really use that terminology anymore. And he says, it's hard living. It's death from hard
Interesting.
living.
Yeah.
And so she
Oh,
probably
gosh.
did live a hard life, and a lot of these women were addicted
Drugs,
to
alcohol.
drugs and
yeah.
alcohol.
I wonder, could it be related to like a UTI or something like that? Like
No,
kidneys and-
nephritis,
know.
probably not.
Probably not. Okay.
Yeah. So
I don't
but
know
good
anything about
question.
But
human
I'll bet
biology.
she, but I'll
Yeah.
bet she had UTIs. I would bet you that she had them throughout the course of her life. Come on.
Kidneys
Yeah.
relates to-
We all know what
Yeah.
that's like.
know?
Miserable. Yeah, of course.
Oh God, that's awful. And we also know, right? And we learned about this a little bit from our guide when we went to Butte, which we'll talk about.
Right.
And I don't know why, but I hadn't really thought so much about this, but also the aspect of, pregnancy and
Yes.
abortions and botched abortions. So I'm sure women were dying of those.
There could be
type of
health related
things
issues
too,
related
right?
to that too.
Or
yeah.
maybe, could you have taken some kind of potion by accident or something, or taken too much of something that you thought might give you an abortion? And I don't know.
It
Right.
could end up harming your health. Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And the number one question that people ask, so we do a walking tour, red light district walking tour, and people always ask, how did these women prevent pregnancy? And so there's all these things that they were doing to prevent pregnancy, which were probably causing some of these problems that are listed in their deaths as well. So oftentimes they would douche with vinegar or carbolic acid, or a little later on Lysol. And that is not good for your vagina.
Lysol.
Or anything in there. No, I know.
So,
Or they're
no.
taking herbs that they're getting,
Herbs, yeah.
from folks. So there's
Honey oil,
there's so many,
yeah.
exactly, different kinds
Yeah.
of things. So sometimes there were physical barriers they would try to use. We talk about the introduction of condoms a little bit,
Yeah.
but a lot of times it was these douching methods that were very challenging, or that's something
Yeah.
they were ingesting to promote abortion. So health wise. But Crystal, how did some of these women come to be sex workers, do you think? Have you been able to find anything out about that?
Yeah. And we have a colleague, Mary Murphy, who did her master's thesis on prostitution in Butte, Montana. And she talks about this in her master's thesis. And so she says, that oftentimes these women come from homes that were poverty stricken. I mean, at this time that we're talking about, the 1870s, the 1880s, there was a lot of families that were just really hard on their luck. And so probably a lot of the women came from those families, were trying to make a living, not just for themselves, but for their families that were having issues. There was no Social Security, there was no Medicare, there was nothing to fall back on in these days for families that were living in poverty. And so you know, if you came from a family like that, this was one of your only options. You could also work as a woman in the 19th century in as a teacher. You could work in domestic service. You could work in a household doing kind of housework and child care for families. You could work in factories, but none of those jobs paid you a living wage. And so there was no way as a single woman to work in a job where you could make a living wage unless you had help from family or a husband.
Mhm.
So a lot of these women would find this out. They'd start working in a factory situation and they wouldn't be able to feed and clothe themselves. And so then a gentleman would come up and say, "Hey, you want to go on a date? You want to go out for a nice dinner?" And this woman is probably like, "Yes, I haven't had a nice dinner for weeks." And so she'd go on a date and she'd go to dinner and it was really nice. And then he'd say, "You want to go for dinner again?" And maybe he'd give her a gift.
Mm.
And so, and then maybe the next time was, you know, there was something in return for these gifts that was happening. And so that's how a lot of women kind of fell into prostitution, is
Mhm.
through kind of going on these dates and getting gifts and food and things they needed.
And then maybe being
And
told
then-
they had to repay in some
Yeah.
way and they were indebted or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they fell into it, you know, and it was good money. It was really good money. But
Yeah.
then they fell into the violence and the drug abuse and all the things that went with it.
And the shame and the
Yeah.
public social ostracism, I'm sure. So that's a lot of, ugh.
Yeah, and I think it's probably tempting sometimes to say, well, was this profession empowering?
Right,
Because you
right.
are able to make a little bit more money. Maybe you could have a little bit of a nicer lifestyle. Maybe you could have nice things. But of course, you're subject to all of this violence, and we wouldn't ever want to idealize it in any way, because I think by all accounts, it was pretty horrible. I mean, I'm sure there were nice moments and we kind of see glimpses of that here and there, but in general, it's not
Yeah.
really something that somebody would want to grow up doing
And
necessarily.
you know, but it is a complex issue.
Yeah.
It is really
Mhm.
complex. And so, you know, maybe there was some agency that these women had, certain women in certain places at certain times.
Right.
So
Because some would take their wealth and then do something with it. And I think there was probably that knowledge that occasionally some women were able to put their money into jewelry, valuables, or other things they could take with
Yeah.
them or become property owners. We know some of those, but that seems to have been really not the norm, but
Mhm.
maybe that was the idea. But I want to ask you another question about some women fell into it maybe on these dates, or did madams ever bring women in
Yeah.
in a different way into the profession? Were they responsible also?
Yeah. So, you know, women were trafficked in. Of course, Chinese women were trafficked in, but other young women were there was sex trafficking in the 19th century, just like there is today. There probably always has been through time.
Right.
But there's one example from the Bozeman red light district that I want to speak to because it really gives a good example of how this works. So there was this woman, Lizzie Woods, that, you know, she's the one that I mentioned a few minutes ago that died when she was 65 years old. She was a madam in Bozeman, and she was probably worked her way up into that madam position. She probably was a prostitute first, working in Bozeman. She came to Bozeman in the 1870s, probably started working as a prostitute. She bought a house in Bozeman's red light district in 1886. She actually owned her own house. And she lived in that house until she died, and when she was 65 years old in 1918. And so she often had a few women who worked at her house. Well, in 1901, we know this from the local newspapers. This case came to court with Lizzie Woods because Lizzie Woods would often go back to St. Louis, Missouri. On one of her trips, she met this young woman who was 14 years old,
Oh,
very young,
heavens.
very young.
Oh,
And she encouraged her to come back to Bozeman, Montana with her to help her care for her daughter,
mm.
be a companion for her daughter. Well, Lizzie Woods didn't have a daughter.
Mhm.
So this was a line.
Complete ruse.
Complete ruse to get her back to
Wow.
Bozeman. She brought her back to Bozeman, set her up in her house. And then, of course, this girl, her name was Maud Ross. Maud immediately understood what was happening. And she had enough wherewithal to go and find the sheriff and tell him that she had been brought back for immoral purposes. And so the sheriff got her out of the house and promptly arrested Lizzie Woods. And so Lizzie Woods was posted bail for $500, got out, went to court. A jury was summoned. She went to court, and they went through a court proceeding with this. They called it at that time white slavery. So that's what
Okay.
that was the terminology that they were charging Lizzie Woods with, is with white slavery, which we call today sex trafficking. And so they charged her with this. They went through a court process, and she was charged with that offense, with bringing this girl here against her will. Not really against her will, but for
Well,
immoral
yeah,
purposes.
yeah.
Yeah, false
Yeah.
pretenses.
Mhm.
So guess how much she didn't go to jail. She was fined $150 plus fees, and then the ticket. They wanted her to pay for the ticket for Maud Ross to go home on the train. Probably $200 total.
Wow.
Of course, Lizzie Woods just plunked that right down and went back to work.
Yeah.
Problem.
Problem, you
Right.
know?
Wow.
So of course, you know, she was charged with this offense, but it was no big deal to her.
Right.
And she probably did it again the next time she went to St. Joseph, Missouri, you know? So
Well, and the
that happened a lot.
hypocrisy too, because, you know, so many of these men that would have been involved as police or sheriffs or mayors or whatever of the city, these town fathers were people that would be frequenting the red light
Mhm.
district and
Yeah.
and having relations with these young women.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah, the
So-
dynamics between the brothels and the police are, from what we've gathered from our brief research and just in our discussions, very intertwined.
Very intertwined.
Pretty awful. I mean, we know in Butte that they would have to pay the police in order to come and protect them,
Mhm.
which is just bizarre. And Beverly Snodgrass's brothel was reportedly burned down by the police when she didn't pay them. So just speaking to that, violent, and I mean, of course we know, I mean, I don't know how much I can say here, but the police have a complicated and sordid
Right.
past in this
And
country,
and
you know?
interrelationship with
Yeah.
these red light districts.
And they're not always there to protect you.
Yeah.
Right,
They're
unless
sometimes
you're
against
paying,
you.
but we'll just leave
Yeah.
that there, that we know these historical cases.
Yeah.
So Chelsea, let's
Yes.
talk about where we were last Sunday, because
Oh my gosh.
I know you and Ryan
happiest
probably
place on
went
earth.
before, but you and you set up a great chance for us to go and tour the Dumas. So
Yes,
yeah, let's
it's
talk
my
about that.
fourth time going. Rylan and I had already gone 3 times, and once with Michael Fox. We arranged a tour with Ted Ackerman.
Yes, a big shout out to Ted
Yes,
Ackerman.
he is awesome.
Yes. What's his tours called? The
The
Mule something Mule?
Butte Mule Tours.
Butte Mule Tours.
He
People
didn't bring
should
mule.
totally no mules.
That was disappointing.
I don't know where that I would have ridden it through the brothel, but
Absolutely.
he had so much historical knowledge
Yes.
About the place, and he's been, I think, actively cleaning it out. Well, anyway, we'll let you talk to Ted on your own, but go ahead.
This is a man who really loves the Dumas brothel. So, we were all very much at home and geeking out.
Maybe not your mom, but
maybe not my
we
mom. My
were.
mom
Yeah.
She was like, wow, you love history, don't you? Like, she kind of had a cap to
I
her
think she was
interest.
creeped out by some of the rooms.
I think
yeah,
so too.
I know.
I think so too.
Understandably.
And it is creepy. And we talk a lot about the hauntings, right?
Yes.
It's pretty famous for, for those who are maybe not so interested in the history, they come to it for the hauntings.
The hauntings
And-
and the feeling of presence. there.
Yes, and we should say, not to kind of set up any false expectations, it's not open to the public. There was a time when you could arrange tours with the owners who came weekly. They live in Eastern Montana. That's not really going on right now. So, but you can find Ted Ackerman, and if he's available, he can take you through. It's not really open as an actual museum right now. It has been at other points in its past. But right now it's just sort of, there's a couple of guys in Butte that have the keys, and if you can find them, they will let you in and they will tell you about it. And it's my favorite thing to do.
And a lot of it
yeah.
is left as it was. So it
Yes.
operated as a brothel
Mhm.
until 1982, as
Yep.
we said,
Mhm.
but there's parts of it that probably haven't been used for much longer.
Yeah.
And they really are very much intact, and they found
Yes.
things in walls and
Yes.
under things as they've been cleaning it
Yes.
out, and artifacts. So we should talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that.
Yeah, and I just want to say, maybe also we could speak to this too, the sort of general impression. I went and expecting to be very spooked and to feel things like poking me and pushing me down the stairs and stuff.
Or even
Or
goosebumps.
goosebumps,
Yeah,
because that's what
okay.
these TV shows
Or maybe
sort
a
of
feather boa tickling the
maybe.
back
Oh,
of your
I
neck. I
wish.
know.
I mean, I didn't feel ever anything like that. And instead, when you walk in, I mean, of course, it's in many ways left, untreated, and there's stuff everywhere, but it's
It's
beautiful.
a mess. It's beautiful mess. It's
It's
a beautiful mess.
just like
Yes,
me, and that's
absolutely.
really why I love it so much. Because you walk in and the light is shining from the skylight.
Oh,
All of the
beautiful.
rooms are around this sort of central skylight, and I feel nice. I feel like
Why don't we go
Yeah.
through our pictures
Yes.
first,
Oh,
and then
yeah,
we
yeah.
can kind of
Okay,
react to them as we
exactly.
go. So
Mhm.
let's just, go back one, Rylan, just, and then we'll go. Yes. So there, just see, this is the 1929 photograph and the 1931 map, showing that the Dumas is all the way back to the alley now. And there's the if you can see under the red arrow, those things on top of the roof are the skylights you were mentioning.
Right.
So right there
beautiful.
on Mercury, and then up the street from that to the left
Mm.
is the Windsor and the Victoria hotels, but really brothels, are
Mhm.
still operating at that time. So then
Yes.
let's go to the next slide so we can start looking at some more of this. Okay.
Yes. So, what we're seeing here are actually three different
Floors of the building,
Sorry,
which is
yeah.
which totally getting back to the hierarchy. I feel like that's a
Mhm.
really good example. So
Mhm.
yeah, talk
Yeah, so
about
that
that a little.
middle picture, it's actually facing the other direction. So when you walk into the door, in the front door, you have this red carpet from who knows what
God
time,
knows when.
70s,
Yeah. Blech.
50s, I'm not sure. And then we have this door window thing happening. And this is where, as I understand it, according to Ted, and maybe Ellen Baumler as well, this is
Yes.
sort of the kind of like the mid-price level. Like when you walk in, this is for maybe like your more like middle class clients.
And so what we're seeing are the doors
Yeah.
and windows. That was from
Mhm.
a later remodel. They said that were turned into those mid-level cribs.
Mhm.
Originally, when it was built in 1890, big bars and
Oh,
parlor
yes.
houses where people ate. There was a
Mhm.
cook. There was a whole big kitchen in the back.
Yes.
So it was originally basically that whole parlor house style.
Mhm.
And then later, yes, it turned into these mid-level cribs.
Yes. And we forgot to mention too, when you walk in to the right is a bar. Or
Yeah.
there would have been a bar.
Yeah, which I think
So-
they should bring back.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay.
Absolutely.
But then
And
there's an upstairs. So talk
Mhm.
about that too.
So there is an upstairs, and it's so interesting looking at these pictures because I really feel an affinity to these women, especially since, having had a hand in helping to write our play with Rylan and spending so much time here
Yeah.
and learning about them. And so we've come to know, to whatever degree you can know, Eleanor Knott, the madam from the 1950s. And Eleanor Knott would have lived up here. This was
She was fancy.
She was fancy
And apparently beautiful.
and beautiful. Although what's really difficult is if you go to the archives or if you're trying to tap into what I'd say kind of professional historians or serious
Right.
researchers, they don't have any pictures of her.
Right.
Ted has a picture of her, or what he believes to be a picture
Which
of
is,
her.
it's a drawn thing. I don't know. Yeah.
And then there's another guy, Chris Fisk, who we work with sometimes. Who's
Right.
lovely, a former history teacher. He has a what he thinks is a picture of her, but no one has ever been able to say this is her. So, you want to be able to see what she looks like. But yes, we do know that she was wealthy. She had many jewels and she owned a Harley Davidson. And some sources say red convertible, others say pink, but probably a flashy car. And she lived upstairs. So there's this almost like a studio apartment where there's like a living area up here. And then there's also a bedroom where she reportedly died of what the coroner's report says was coronary occlusion, which is of course a heart attack. We're not sure if that's true, but so Eleanor Knott's room would be there. And then also we learned that sort of Eleanor, or the madam of the times, second in command.
Yeah, so
would be up
the
there as
two
well.
primary, the madam, the second command, and then the more favored women, the higher priced women. So that was definitely, and then that railing that you're seeing, they said there would have been something there. This was put in later, but that you can see down to the entry level, the main floor where the red carpet was, but then you've got those skylights right above you, and the amount of light, it was beautiful. It's a beautiful space. I would have rented out a space up there.
Really?
And all
I
the
feel
rooms
really
were,
good
yeah,
up there.
I know, I
Like,
know. It's
where are
weird.
these ladies? Let's hang
And you have
out.
an incredible view
Yes.
down of the
Butte.
rest of Butte.
But
Yeah.
then what
Yeah,
about
then go to the third
the
photo.
third
Yes.
photo?
Then you
Yeah.
go downstairs.
This is
So
scary.
this is terrifying.
Yes. Yes.
And so the lower level, and it may or may not be the lowest level, but what
Right.
is sort of open to us and
Correct.
what is known to history to be the lower level, is where the how would we say, like, it's the lower price.
Yeah, oh yeah, and it's
Maybe
door
not so-
window, but
Mhm.
windows only onto the interior.
Yes.
It's dark, it's foundation walls, and I've got some other pictures later,
Yeah.
but these are where later, when they had to go underground because the threats of prohibition and all these other things, they could literally go through those underground tunnels that were built to have the steam go out from the center of a street to heat all the houses. Those steam tunnels, then they could connect to these underground doors, and they could come in either through the back through the laundry or the front where there would have been another bar in the
Yes.
basement, right?
Mhm.
And then there were these cribs where there was no sink, right? No running water in the corner. Just a bit, yes, they did have buzzers, so you could
Yes.
buzz if there was an issue. But upstairs you
Mhm.
can see the plaster on the walls,
Mhm.
that's in relief and painted and
There's
really,
intention to making it really beautiful.
yeah, and even the rooms inside had nice furniture and were big and spacious and all had light. And then in the basement, it was just
business.
gnarly. Ooh.
So now tell me about the other photo that's on here, the
Yeah.
Blue Range.
Is
So-
this the building that was taken down?
Yeah, so that building was across from the Dumas and it on Mercury Street. It is no longer there. It was taken down a couple of decades ago, and it as you can see just from the outside, even though it's all boarded up, door, window, classic crib. On the bottom, those women would have been sitting in the window or tapping on the glass, and they would have been in full height. And then you could come in the door. And then there were cribs on the top. On the second story, you would have had to enter off the alley, off the back. So this is the one built specifically to be a crib, not even trying to hide it in the alleyway. This was right on one of these main streets,
And this
Mercury
is
Street.
Right across the street from the Dumas.
Right across
Yeah,
from the
yeah,
fancier one. So if that's
yeah.
all you could afford, you went
Mhm.
over there. And so that seems more like what I think you would have been getting in the basement, you
Mhm.
know, just horrible. And then later there was a high school down the street, and we heard some horrible stories
yes.
about lunch specials.
Yeah,
The,
apparently Ruby Garrett, the
like,
last
let's go,
bad,
yeah, let's see some more
Yeah, and
photos
I-
from the
this
inside.
too.
Oh, okay, and we'll get to that really
Mhm.
quick.
Yeah.
So out the back,
Great
right?
picture of me.
Yeah, out the back
Go
is where, when they built on the extension of the first floor cribs and they changed the first floor, it went out to Venus Alley. And so there would have been women here, and this backed on to all the saloons
Yep.
where Dirty Mouth Jean
Yep.
ran her saloon and things all on Galena Street. And so you would have walked up and down here, and where all that metal is behind Ted's in the silver hair and the dark top next to your mom.
Yeah.
And
Was, like, closing her arms because she's freezing.
right. And all of that was during World War II. They used metal to completely close that off. Although later they cut that hole in the Dumas, you could still get in through a metal door with a slide window. But those were all cribs that were door, window, and women would have sat there in the windows off the alley, and men could have walked right in off Venus Alley.
Yeah.
So let's go to the next one, because that's a picture of one of the cribs that would have opened
Yes.
off.
Gorgeous.
And
Actually,
after
I was
this
like,
one, let's talk about your letter. Yeah, let's go to the
Yeah.
next one, Rylan. So this is, though, in comparison to that dingier room, this is what upper story rooms look like. And you can see a lot of light coming in, really nice rooms, and then a nice flush toilet that would have been shared up there, sinks in the corner. And then
And Ted kept commenting about the
Yeah.
sink level.
yes.
I don't know if we want to share that, but he was saying that the upper level sinks were standard height versus the lower level, which were lower because men would pee in them.
or women
Or-
would have
or
washed in them.
perfume
They would have been
Yeah.
used as sort of that kind of bathing
As opposed
facility.
to being used for proper
Right. So
Yes.
upstairs they were proper sinks in the rooms for water, and then you had lower, and you could then ring and buzz for food and
Yeah.
stuff to be delivered. So let's go to the next one.
Sorry, just
Rylan.
very briefly,
Oh.
that room with the red bed is
Yeah.
the room where Eleanor Knott would have slept, and where she
Okay.
supposedly was found dead.
Oh yes. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. This is showing you the interior of rooms down in the lowest level, and you can see there's kind of a chamber pot by this window that would have opened onto this, and then where that yellow chair is behind it, you can see the foundation wall in the basement. So they wouldn't have even had proper plastering or wallpaper, because all the rooms upstairs wallpapered, plastered, linoleum floors. You had some of that downstairs, but not very nice. And you just basically had a space for a wash basin and then a bed behind a curtain.
And according to Ted, a lot of what we see in these pictures are original to the Dumas.
Right.
So if you look at the image all the way to the right, for example, I believe he said everything besides the money and one other thing were original. So he pointed out, it's hard to see in this picture, but
Yeah.
there's a really lovely, sweet little bird cage
Yeah.
in the corner that is kind of to the, if you were lying in the bed, to the left of the bed.
Yeah.
And which I found really interesting and kind of
It's
a
kind of
metaphor.
poignant. You know, the bird in the cage. And then he also showed us down here probably what we thought was one of the most amazing artifacts that you have transcribed. So let's talk about that.
So Ted pulled out this framed piece of, crumpled up paper that had been unfolded with barely legible writing from 1917. And I'm just going to read it. It's dated June 7th, 1917. And it says, "Dear Sarah, I love you. We will have this child together. I will quit the mine soon. I will get you out of the Dumas. We will move away and have our family. We will start over. I love you, John."
And what was the year of that letter?
1917, June 7th, 1917.
And Ted told us that just after that, later that year, within a month or so, he said that was when there was that huge mine disaster that Michael knows the name of. The speculator mining disaster in Butte, where so many men died.
Yeah.
And so we don't know, right? If this letter is.
Yeah, I mean, when I first saw this letter, I was like, oh my goodness, this is incredible. This is the most, and if this is authentic, I mean, what an absolute
What a story.
treasure.
Yeah.
I
And
did see it on Ghost Hunters when I watched it this morning.
Oh, so that makes us a
I
little
took it, like,
nervous.
with a grain of salt. But I don't know if we could ever do any kind of analysis on it or something, but
It would be fascinating.
Yeah.
And it is sort of the story we always think about, that a miner would have fallen in love with one of these women that fell on hard times and had to find herself trying to make a living, but really she's pregnant, there's love, he wants to get her out, and then you wonder if this was a real person, what happened to her if he died in that accident. I know.
And
so that's-
actually, there is a Sarah that we have researched, and also that they referenced on Ghost Hunters. I'm so sorry; these are my sources. But in our research,
Is the Ghost Hunters online where other people can watch it if they
it's
want?
Ghost
Okay.
Hunters. It's
Ghost
like
Hunters, the Dumas brothel edition,
There's like
something
a
like that.
million seasons, and
Okay.
yeah, you just look for Dumas brothel, and it's literally just people who are like. Actually, I will say. And I don't think this is quite a detour. It was really shocking. At one point, the host goes, in order to get these ghosts, the ghosts of the, wealthy men who haunt this brothel, we need to bring them exactly what they're looking for, women. And they have
No.
women dressed as like they have corsets on.
No.
Yes. And they put them in the various rooms and they're sitting there in the bed. And then it's like, it's like that. So it's
I'm proud of you for making it through that
Thank you.
episode.
So much. It was really difficult. And
Yikes.
I forgot why I even brought this up. Oh, Sarah. So
Sarah
in our
appeared.
research, yeah, they do talk about Sarah, and they say that this Sarah is the same Sarah who, in stories of the Dumas brothel, allegedly killed herself.
Mhm.
So they make the connection that this Sarah killed herself after this happened, but we don't know if that's true.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yikes.
All right. Well,
Um,
we should probably keep moving on to the
I
photos.
just,
Yeah.
I would like to, but before we move on totally, I just wanted to say, could you tell us a little bit more about Eleanor before we move
Yes.
on to some of the artifacts that we have
Yeah.
from the museum and from the Dumas?
Yeah.
Well, I am eternally fascinated by Eleanor, and I kind of want to like quit my job and pursue a PhD and trying to figure out who she actually was, because there is not a lot of research on her, and most of our research was done with like google.com and also going to the Butte
You guys
archives.
went to the Butte archives,
We
though,
did, and we
yeah,
asked, I said, really, is there not a picture? Is there not an
I
article?
know.
So there is very, very little on her, and I wonder
And,
if
you
it
know,
could
that's
be
how it is.
Yeah.
You know, that's
right.
I feel your frustration.
Right. Right. But there's
Yeah.
so much lore around her. And the central question about her is seemingly, how did she die? So there's a lot of speculation out there, and the coroner's report, which is, you can Google it, you can find it. It's also at the Dumas brothel. It lists her death as coronary occlusion, which is a heart attack. We know that she was 36 years old, which I'm saying is maybe, I don't know. We don't hear of a lot of 36-year-olds having heart attacks, but of course we know that it was a very tough life. But we also know have learned through lore. It's kind of hard to tell exactly what's true and what's fiction.
Absolutely.
But seemingly what we do know is that she was the owner of the brothel. She was the madam of the brothel for 4 years in the early 50s. She died in February of 1955, and that her body was found in this room. And that her successor was a woman named Bonita Ferrant, who's also in our play. And Ted was kind of getting into this too. What Ted told us was that a will was found on her body.
Right. Was that the first time you had both heard that?
No, well, what we had found in our research is similar, was
Okay.
that the deed was signed over to Bonita Ferrant. And so in our play, not to do a spoiler, but we sort of suggest that maybe Bonita, signed it herself. But we also kind of create a sense of like, we don't know if Bonita actually killed her.
And Bonita was another woman who worked in the brothel.
Yes.
Okay.
She was another, as I understand it, one of these top floor prostitutes. And she, again, it's hard to tell what's true and what's fiction. So this is why I really want to try to get some hard evidence, right? But the story goes that her husband was potentially connected to the mob. So it could be that Bonita or her husband or someone related to her husband had Eleanor killed, so that then the deed or the ownership of the brothel would go over to Bonita. We do know that Bonita was her successor. Dirty Mouth Jean was also in the mix. We know that, well, we know, quote unquote, we hear through lore, and it's also in our play that Dirty Mouth Jean she and Eleanor weren't exactly friends, that maybe she could have been involved in having her killed. There's also this other element of, stories say that she had this lover, that she had a married lover,
Right,
who was wealthy. It was a businessman in town, slated to run away together. So on this night, she had been packing her bags and planning to run away. She's found dead. The lover was also found dead.
Yes.
Mm.
Also,
pulmonary
of a
occlusion.
heart attack.
Strange.
I know. Right? Yeah.
According to Ted was saying, this guy actually died of a heart attack, but we don't really know that. Or maybe
In Ellen Baumler's account, she said that he died and that Eleanor then committed suicide because she was so distraught.
Right. And that's another story that and we don't really know. I mean,
right.
We know again that there was drugs and that there was alcohol. I mean, maybe she overdosed, maybe she was killed by overdose. I mean, we have absolutely no idea,
but the
right?
ownership
the
and
coroner's
transfer
report is
are
what we have.
kind of suspicious.
Right.
So yeah.
And the 2 simultaneous heart attacks.
Right.
I mean, what a beautiful way to go. Like if your lover has a heart attack at the exact same time. But that just
I don't
seems
think
not
that was the
likely,
case,
right?
yeah.
And then also,
More to the story, I'm
right,
sure.
there's more to the story, which is why it fascinated us so much.
But
which is why I
somehow
want to quit everything
the
and get my
ownership,
PhD in Eleanor not.
the ownership passes to Bonita somehow
Yeah.
without Eleanor signing it over. And then all of the things that Eleanor owns that you talked about.
Yeah.
What happened to those?
Nobody has any idea.
Mm.
So her wealth, her money, her jewels, her Harley Davidson, her car,
Wow.
they
Wow.
all disappear.
All right.
So
So
heart attacks can do that.
you're going to
Yeah.
want to go see, and I have my gloves on because we're going to start talking about
Yes.
artifacts. So Rylan, let's do one more slide. We'll see artifacts from the Dumas, and then we'll look at the ones we have from the collection here. Okay, so here's just a couple things we snapped photos of at the Dumas. They have some things, if you ever get in, that they have found and that they have on display. And I believe a lot of what we photographed were things that had been found in the structure. So in the upper left, we have a braided whip that was found in one of the walls. Am I right about that?
At which point my mother said,
Oh yeah,
what's that
what's
for?
that for? And we declined to answer. So
Uh-huh.
moving on. In another one of the rooms is two examples of plug-in electrified massagers, and then a manual above it. And then the object itself that the manual is referring to is almost like this electrified pillow that you lay on that was also an electrified massager, but not those metal versions that you're seeing now. We have some of those versions which have a manual that call it a vibrator that are here in Museum of the Rockies. So we'll move to that in a minute. But if you look just below that, you see that there's some cream there, and it says it's a cream to help prevent contraception, to work for contraception, so that, you know, women would have used these things as a way to prevent getting pregnant. There's some vaginal jelly pamphlet down there about products. There's other different kinds of bottles that would have had probably things you could take either to prevent pregnancy or for douching. So we're seeing a whole bunch of different artifacts that they had found in the walls and around the Dumas. And then we have some things in the Museum of Rocky's own collection. So we'll move to our overhead camera and have a look. So this is pretty spectacular here. And I don't know if we can even zoom in a tiny bit more, but this is actually one of those very same massagers, probably from a slightly different year than the ones we saw there, but pretty much the same design. And from what we hear, there were several different companies that made these, and they were sold as vibrating massage tools that you would plug in. In this case, this is quite an old one. So you would screw it in the way you would screw in a light bulb into a socket. So they would have had either sockets hanging in a room or in a wall that you could have put this in, and then quite a long cord. So then you could get it over to where you needed to use it. And then this particular one comes with all of these different attachments that you would just screw on. So kind of like massagers today, or those massage chairs, if you ever get a pedicure that you sit in, and then all the different kneading and tools. But we do tend to find these often associated with brothels. So even though the manuals themselves don't specifically talk about using massagers for sexual pleasure, it's pretty well known from these eras. So let me also open the other box that we have, which has a second one. These are all tagged and come from the collection.
Really quick, does that device seem pleasurable to you?
That is a really excellent question, Chelsea. I just have to get it to you. You're gonna have to be a guest again because you ask the best questions in the most evocative way. This looks like more like a torture device to me. I'm not running out wishing somebody would remake these kind of more Victorian and early 20th century. I bet if you had really sore muscles, like you were a miner and you needed some massaging, maybe this was a nice way that a woman could help you out. And again, this also has the plug-in here. And then we do have a manual that's from a later model, but we would love to show that to you too. And Michael's going to bring it over here.
While Michael's bringing that over, the first massager that you showed, Nancy, has a date of about 1905 to 1910. And then the second one was about 1902. And so, and then this manual is from 1917.
So it spans, these are in use for a long time, and we're not seeing a lot of change even in the way that the machine looks. And again, a lot of different companies were making them. So this is about the vibratory technique. So Chelsea, there you go. This
it's a
is an
manual
electric
describing how to
vibrator.
use it.
And then we have this woman here. And I think if we could maybe zoom in a little bit, I think it's worth
She looks pretty happy.
Rylan. She's got a nice smile. She's got a fair amount of cleavage showing. And then she's got an attachment onto the vibrating massager right there on her breast.
Yes.
So
Wow.
I'm assuming that's just letting you know that there are other ways that you could use it. But they
How
do
was it?
talk about all of these other conditions.
You
and-
tried it.
and this
was
was-
that what our
That's
poor
different.
They
Oh,
might
yeah.
have
Oh, that's
had it
nephritis.
nephritis.
Nephritis, yeah.
They might have had it for, I don't know why you would use it for a sore throat, but they might have had it in doctor's office, but this was for home use. And so if you were lucky enough to have electricity, you too could have a vibrator. So another one of the
Wow.
artifacts we want to talk about. And should I bring this over here?
Yeah, you can bring that
Is this
over
from an
too.
exhibit at Extreme History?
Yes, so this is not.
That's on loan or?
Correct. This
Okay.
is an artifact that is owned by Jennifer Hill, who is she's a professor at Montana State University that teaches about women's reproductive health. And so this is from her personal collection. And this is a Merry Widow's condom case.
It
And
actually
this one says the 3 Merry Widows condom case. And this was a very, very popular brand of condoms. This company started in the early 1900s and went in through the 1920s, 1930s. This particular case is from the early 1900s. And it's hard to see there, but it does say 3 Merry Widows. And that refers to 3 condoms that would be held in this case. And these are reusable condoms. And so
How exciting. Reusable, so ecologically friendly. Yuck. I know, right? So yeah, you can kind of see the Merry Widows
I gotta
there.
say though, the case
Is very, it is, I mean, I feel like this would have been for high-end
Mhm.
condom use,
Probably.
maybe where you, yeah.
I think the idea of a reusable condom sounds like disgusting to us today. But I don't know. It does seem
kind of the way
sustainable.
things worked.
And
Yeah.
what is it made of?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What would the condom
And
be
so-
made of?
So the Merry Widows was a popular brand, and it was a more expensive brand because they were tested. So the Merry Widow condoms were tested to ensure that they had no tears or holes. And because testing was an expensive process, these Merry Widows condoms sold for $1 for one of these tins. So
How were they tested?
and-
No, don't
Yeah.
answer that.
yeah, hopefully they were just, shining up against some light and there's no holes in them. But in contrast, there were a lot of other brands of condoms that were on the market that were not tested, and
Oh.
they were sold for a lot less.
Okay.
But the Merry Widow was the one you wanted, and if
I love
you
the
know,
name, the
yeah.
Merry Widows,
Merry
3
Widows.
Merry Widows,
And if
yeah.
you think that actually, is that supposed to suggest like happy widow?
Yeah, so it was really the term Merry Widow was commonly used to imply kind of a sexually experienced and very independent woman. And the term Mary traditionally had a sexual connotation. And this the Merry Widow condoms kind of became known when you would say a Merry Widow, that was kind of a
Mm.
a euphemism for condom, because it became so popular.
Well, you're not spoiling a
Yeah.
woman. She's already been married and had
Yeah.
kids. And so she's a widow. So maybe there was also that idea that she could continue to enjoy a sexual life. And so
Somehow the
Okay.
idea that maybe she could.
maybe, yeah. Boy, what a weird old fashioned notion. I know.
So
So,
fun tonight.
so we are winding down, and I want to know what the takeaways are for you both. And Chelsea, let's start with you, because Crystal and I have talked a lot about sex work and prostitution.
Yeah, I mean, all of this has just made me want to know more
Mm.
and just really want to be an advocate for digging into the past and trying as much as possible to unearth these stories. I mean, I think probably a lot of it comes from the fact that there aren't a lot of records of these people, but I also wonder if a lot of the lack of knowledge comes from the lack of desire or will to research these women and their lives. I'm not sure if it's a little bit of
I think
each,
that's a
maybe.
really good point, though, but to think of them as women, not just prostitutes, as
Yes.
whole women who had parents, who had relations, who had a life,
had
who
children.
had
Mhm.
desires, who maybe had children, all of those kinds of things, and to not think of them just as women who you paid to have sex with. I think it depends, history now, everyone's doing history. It used to be men were writing history. So I think it has changed and we're learning a lot more.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah. And I like how you talked about Chelsea kind of, you guys did this research for the play, The Haunted Mountain Theater that you're doing, and you're presenting this in a way that, you don't have all the facts, but you want to know more, and you're kind of tantalizing your audience with this history. So they are like, well, gosh, I want to know more about Eleanor. I want to know more about these women who worked in the Dumas. I want to know more about this history, this particular history. So I really like that. But and the reason that we think it's so important is because what happens in the past is of course still happening currently, and so we tell the story about Lizzie Woods and her trafficking this young woman, and of course that's still happening today. And so if we look back in the past and can understand how this happened, we can bring it to the present and really try to change what's happening as we move forward, and better understanding these women and their work. And of course prostitution has not gone away. We still have prostitution and sex work happening today, and it's a little bit different today, I think, than it was historically, but we can better understand the women and men and everybody who's doing this work today.
Yeah, I mean, it's the oldest profession.
Right,
And it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And I think similarly, of course, issues of women's reproductive health
Yeah.
and rights are extremely topical as well.
Right.
So
And that's why we want to talk about the
Mhm.
massager and the condom
Yeah.
case, because those were big parts of people's lives historically and today too. So let's talk about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
always going to be
Yeah.
a concern or an issue, whether or not, politically supported.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. And so we think we should just talk about it. The more we talk, the
Mhm.
more we learn, the more history.
Yeah.
I just found the whole thing amazing, thinking about the difference between choosing sex work, and having some agency to get into it and get out of it potentially, versus, because we know that's true today as well, versus being trafficked into it or falling into it because you don't have another choice. And usually those people are ending up in the worst conditions. And I think the conditions are everything, and how people are treated in those conditions. And so it's something we just heard about happening in Bozeman, and it's everywhere. And it's definitely something that is very topical and we should be talking about. Trafficking, women's health, sex work, all of it. And with that, we're going to have to wind down our first videoed podcast episode.
Yes.
So, Rylan, if we can go to the last slide, we want to say our thank yous to everybody. So thank you, Chelsea and Ashley, who we see, Chelsea obviously there in the pink, and Ashley above her with the big dinosaur looking like it's going to scoop her up, sort of like King Kong. Ashley had to leave, but you both helped set up this whole thing, and then you agreed to be our first guest, which is fantastic. And we look forward to the Haunted Mountain Theater and the Eleanor Knott story, which you and Rylan have put entirely together. And Rylan, we're so grateful to all the technical help today. Thank you so much. Also, a big thank you to Michael Fox and Melissa Dawn for providing access to the Museum of the Rockies collection and bringing the artifacts up for us to use today. And then thanks to all our listeners out there for joining us today. If you love this podcast and maybe this video cast, please tell a friend and make sure to subscribe so it shows up in your podcast feed each week, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Thanks for listening today, and we hope you can join us again to find out more about the dirt on the past.
Well, a big thank you again to the Museum of the Rockies for the use of this beautiful studio space. And thanks to Michael Fox and Melissa Dawn at the Museum of the Rockies for helping us with the artifacts. And thank you to our editors, Drink Pinnell, Sierra Thomas. Thanks to Lasnell Agria for mixing the music, and to Steve Durbin at KGVM and John Chadwell for help getting the podcast out in the world. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.